Hey guys, how's it going? I'm super pumped to share my next Tom to Town illustration with you guys, featuring the Cupcaker. I'm also going to be sharing my top 5 tips for creating unique and engaging backgrounds for your illustrations. Before we get started, make sure to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any of my videos. And if you really want to support me, make sure to watch this video through to the end.
The YouTube algorithm really likes that.
So stay tuned to the end so you don't miss out on any of those tips. Without further ado, let's talk a little bit about the illustration and get into those tips. As you may know, I've been switching back and forth pretty frequently between my 100 Scene Studies Challenge and my Tom to Town series. This has really helped me stay motivated and not get burnt out on a project, and also not get bored. Fun fact, artists get bored too. It's just a part of life. As you may also know, I'm a big fan of food. So this painting was really an opportunity for me to explore food painting again.
And indulge in the sweets a little bit.
The original sketch is actually quite different from the finalized illustration. I switched things up a lot, which brings me to my first tip. Number 1, play around with different perspectives and layouts. So for this piece, I tried switching up the camera angle and the large set dressing elements like the baking counters. The original sketch had a baking rack in the background, but it felt very stiff and stagnant, and it didn't really feel like it fit in the piece. You also saw a whole lot more of the room. But I really wanted to focus on the character in this illustration and make the piece about her, so I decided to narrow my camera angle a little bit and show a different part of the scene. Sometimes you have to sacrifice the original idea to really illustrate the mood or the theme that you're going for. The perspective for this piece was rough, man. I struggled through it. Perspective grids generally do nothing for me because I get way too in my head about it. So to take my mind off of the brain pain that perspective was putting me through, I started thinking about a few secondary focal points I wanted to include in the piece. Which brings me to tip number 2. Create a compositional hierarchy. I like to work with big, medium, and small shapes in my illustrations to really help bounce your eye across the piece. If everything's the same size, it gets real boring real fast. I really wanted to incorporate some kind of shelving, but like I said earlier, the baking rack just didn't really feel like it fit in the space very well. I looked around on Pinterest for a bit and found a shop with these really cool arched built-in shelves, and a light bulb clicked in my brain. These fit perfectly in the space I wanted to create, and would also allow me to add those little shapes like baking ingredients and tools in a more organic way without just having them strewn around on the counter. For one of my medium shapes, I also really wanted to add a KitchenAid mixer, as it's a pretty iconic baking tool. But more on that later. So the first Tom to Town illustration featured a little feathered friend, so I wanted to give this character a companion as well. Enter in the tortoise. I love animals, but I've always had a bit of an affinity for more exotic animals. Not that tortoises are overly exotic, but I thought it would be a bit more fun than adding like a cat or something to the scene. I want to share a super exciting piece of news with you.
I'm launching my Patreon today! Woo!
Patreon powers membership businesses for creators by giving them the tools they need to acquire, manage, and energize their paying patrons. With a subscription-style payment model, fans pay their favorite creators a monthly amount of their choice in exchange for exclusive access, extra content, or a closer look into their creative journey. This model is a win-win. Creators retain creative freedom while getting the salary they deserve, and fans get to rest easy knowing that their money goes directly toward creating more of what they love. And yes, I did rip this definition straight from the website. But why should you support me? Well, if you love the juxtaposition of cozy, everyday life with the whimsy and wonder of imaginary worlds, then this might just be the place for you. My illustrations are influenced by both ordinary things like fuzzy socks and cups of tea, as well as fantastical things like folklore and hobbit holes. My aim in every illustration is to tell a story, whether that's the story of the everyman enjoying a good book, or an explorer on a quest to write a field journal about dragons. Patreon is the perfect way for me to truly connect with my community and share more of my crazy life as an artist. I really love getting to know each member of my little corner of the art world individually and make the joy of art accessible to each of them. I'll be sharing more behind the scenes of my creative process, coloring pages of my line work illustrations, and you'll be getting a vote in the work I create with exclusive membership polls. I'm also hoping to offer physical rewards in the future such as prints and stickers. My My third tip is a bit of an expansion on my second tip: brainstorm. Take a minute and really think about your piece. I always brainstorm at the beginning of an illustration, whether that's a bit of sketching or writing down some ideas, or even just looking at Pinterest for some inspiration. But I really like to go back in about halfway through my sketching process and try to find some new idea to really liven up the design and bring it to a finish. At the beginning of the sketching process, you're kind of in a blue sky stage where everything's open, and you slowly kind of close that off throughout the sketching process, but I like to keep it open for as long as I can to really tell the story of the scene as best I can. I like to make little brainstorm maps to help me get out all of my ideas in written form so I can pick through them and decide which ones will help me develop my piece and which won't. Who is your character? What is their aesthetic? My character in this scene has a cozy, kind of vintage vibe, so obviously it wouldn't make sense for me to try to place her in a sci-fi steampunk background. You want your character to fit in the style of the space. I really try to treat an illustration like this where the character's the main focal point, like food. Stick with me here, I promise I'm getting to a point. The character is the main meal, but the background is the dessert. It's an opportunity to take something that's already cool and make it even cooler. Is it as visually nutritious as your character? No, maybe not, but it brings the whole thing together. So what kinds of objects would be found in this space? So let's take the idea of the cupcakery. Okay, baking counters. That's good, but what else? Well, shelving and cabinets. That gives us some space to add some smaller items. What else? A few years ago, I went to art camp and took an improv workshop, which is hilarious if you know me. One of the tricks we learned to develop our scenes in acting was to think, yes, and. How can you expand on the idea you already have and make it even better? So a little bonus tip for you is to use that same trick in your illustrations. Think yes, and.
I promise I am not psychotic.
But I talk to myself the whole time I'm illustrating. Keeping a dialogue open with yourself throughout the process is really, really important. So now we have some shelves and some counters that we need to fill up. What kinds of items would you find on a bakery shelf? Maybe ingredients and tools? That's a pretty broad spectrum. We're not creating a full restaurant kitchen, we're creating a cupcakery. Okay, so only ingredients that you would need for cupcakes. That helps narrow it down a little bit. I ended up splitting my ingredients into 3 alliterative categories. I'm a big fan of alliteration. Fillings, flavors, and fixings. So what do bakers use to flavor their cupcakes? Maybe extracts? Well, we can do a shelf of little extract bottles. Maybe vanilla beans? A vanilla bean jar would be fun. Okay, what about fillings? Anyone who knows me knows that caramel immediately came to mind. So we can add a jar of caramel sauce to the top shelf. And chocolate is a must as well. What about fruity fillings? Little jam jars and a cherry jar would be cute. And let's add a honeyberry jar for good measure. Okay, so how about fixings? What are some edible, decorative elements for cupcakes? Obviously, sprinkles for sure. And maybe some M&Ms? Oh, I'm sorry, A&As. And some marshmallows would be good. Maybe we could use some of the colors for jet puffed marshmallow bags on our marshmallows. Sometimes I like using items that already exist, like the KitchenAid mixer or the M&Ms, and incorporating those into my illustrations. Adding little recognizable elements like that can really help people feel a bit more connected with the piece. My 4th tip is to use references. I'm gonna say this, and I'm only gonna say it once. This is not cheating. Obviously, don't just rip somebody else's work and call it your own, but you can most definitely find photographs to help you pose your characters, or find design elements that look cool, or even to help you with your perspective. Reference is your best friend and will truly help you improve your backgrounds. I never would have thought of the arched built-in shelves if I hadn't seen it in a photo. I definitely recommend making a Pinterest board for your illustrations, so you can throw together a whole bunch of ideas and kind of just weed through them as you go. Do your research for your illustrations. I promise you it makes a world of difference. My 5th and probably most important tip is to create cohesion. So after I finalize the sketch, I start thinking about values and color palettes. This is where things are really starting to come together in the design process, and adding color in the light is kind of the cherry on top. Color palettes can be very daunting, and they are one of my biggest fears when it comes to creating an illustration. I'm not overly confident in my knowledge of color theory, so it's a bit of a sore point for me. Now, I want to make my background engaging, but I also don't want it to distract from my character. It needs to fit the design aesthetic and color palette of the character without taking away from her. I like to think about the vibe of the scene and see what colors start coming to mind. I was really feeling cooler greens with this piece, and I thought that a cooler pink would be a nice complement to that. But I wanted the iconic warmer red KitchenAid though, so how am I going to fit that into a cooler color scheme without it looking garish? Okay, maybe I'll shift the greens and the pinks a little bit warmer so that the red doesn't look so cringy. But now there's a big red object in the middle of my scene and no other red objects to be found. How do I make that work? Well, let's add some strawberries on the counter and paint some of the jam jars red too. And the character's apron could also repeat that deeper red, which helps ground her into the scene a bit more. And maybe we can throw a few strawberry slices down on the ground for our little tortoise friend to bring that red further down the piece too. I originally wanted to make the cookie packages on the top shelf a bit of a spoof of Chips Ahoy cookies, which have kind of a sky blue color. But I shifted my greens over to the warm side, so I don't think I can make that cooler blue fit as well. Like I said earlier, sacrifices have to be made sometimes to tell the story of the scene in the best way possible. There were a lot of items on the shelves, and they took forever to paint. I didn't want to make them all one color because that would be boring, but I also didn't want to make them all the colors of the rainbow because that would be obnoxious. So how do you create variety in cohesion? The answer is controlling your values and using neutrals. None of the objects on the shelves have a high contrast from each other, and none of them are overly saturated. They fit in the color scheme with only mild variance. Obviously, the sprinkles needed to be colorful, but even those I tried to keep within the colors that I'd already been using throughout the rest of the piece. Another element of cohesion that I really liked for this illustration was the repetition of the pattern from the jam jars to the character's apron. The jars have a red and white plaid pattern, and the apron has a red and white checkers pattern. So my top 5 tips for creating unique and engaging backgrounds for my illustrations are: number 1, find the best angle for your piece and play around with different perspectives. Number 2, create a compositional hierarchy of focal points. Number 3, brainstorm. I recommend brainstorming before a piece and during the piece. Don't think that you've explored every idea, because I promise you, you haven't. Midway through your sketch, if you're stuck, just sit down and ask yourself some questions. Number 4, use references. If you want to create an engaging background, you have to communicate your ideas clearly. People have to be able to identify the objects in your background to be able to engage with them. And number 5, create cohesion. Cohesion with your character and cohesion within the background itself. The point is to create a background that people want to engage with. And people don't want to engage with something that's discordant and distracting. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed seeing my painting process for this illustration, and I hope these tips were helpful for you. If you're interested in coloring this illustration yourself, the coloring page is available on my Patreon. And if you're simply interested in supporting me and following along with my art journey, make sure to subscribe to this channel, follow me on social media, and consider becoming a patron over on Patreon. Bye guys!